College football nerds here talking top 10. It's pretty much become our favorite segment of the week. I got Josh here with me. He's going to get nerdy with y'all as well as myself. It's a light week this week for games. I've been saying that this year with super conferences, we don't have a lot of these weeks, but we do have one this week. So instead of doing 2 or 3 previews, we're going to do something really interesting. Keep an eye out for it later in the week. We're going to do a tier ranking for the SEC, and that discussion sort of plays off of this discussion as well. So we're going to go ahead and get into this. Want to do maybe 2 pieces of homework for y'all. One, obviously like, subscribe. It helps us out. We tell you every week, and it really does. But in the comments, give us your top 10. I think that'll be a lot of fun. It'll give us some things to talk to y'all about and tell you where you're wrong, and you can tell us where we're wrong. All right, Josh, I'm going to do mine first. Let you think a little bit on how you can tell me how I'm wrong. For me, and I think for everybody, Georgia, number 1. They, another sleepy win this week. Didn't play anybody of note, but Georgia's schedule is going to get tough this year, and they have a sequencing issue where they put a lot of good teams in a row. So they're going to have an opportunity to prove out that number 1. And I think even they can take a loss or 2, and I still might feel like they're the best team in the country. Number 2, I've got Texas. I know there was some discussion last week. Ohio State fans got mad at me and Josh, and you, Josh, about bumping Ohio State down. But I think at this point, one, it doesn't matter where you are ranked right now. This is just a fun discussion. We shuffle a lot week to week because we don't want to be married to these things. But Texas at number 2 is pretty obvious to me, especially what they did to Michigan. And look, I don't think Michigan's a great team right now. That's not, I don't think, a scandalous thing to say. They're not a great team right now, but Texas could have beaten them by 40 points if they wanted to, by 50 maybe, the way that game was playing out. I've got Bama. I got Ohio State number 3, Bama right behind them. Ohio State did what I wanted them to do in week 1, and that was start early and click early and not have to keep everybody in the game trying to score late to make it look good or whatever. Offensive line looked better this week. Offense in general looked better this week. And I think it's worth noting that, there wasn't much we could glean from the opponent in week 1. But in week 2, they played somebody that gave Wisconsin all they could handle in week 1. I think that was a 2-touchdown game for Wisconsin against Western Michigan, but it was a late 2 touchdowns. So Ohio State number 3 for me, Bama number 4. Look, we'll get into this in our Bama preview, but that offensive line it was patchwork. They had their first and second string left tackles out for that game. A lot of reshuffling, had a lot of downstream effects. There were some concerns for me about Jalen Milroe. I still have them. But then the defense looked great. Given all the precarious positions that offense put them in, defense looked outstanding. Tennessee right behind Alabama. There could be a good argument for Tennessee being ahead of Alabama. It really depends on how much you think Nico is great versus Nico hasn't played nobody, Paul, and what you think about NC State. I'm not super high on them, but I do think that Tennessee handled their business in a way that I didn't really expect. And look, I had Tennessee in my top 10 last week, so I'm pretty proud of that, but I moved them up. Ole Miss hasn't played anybody. I think they have a great roster. I think they have a great opportunity to win a lot of games, not a super tough schedule. But the rest of these are just kind of a question mark. Miami is up there after Ole Miss for me. Miami has a win against a team with a roster. Florida's not got a great roster, but it is an SEC team. Maybe they're in that bottom tier when we discuss it, but it wasn't an FCS school. It wasn't a bad G5. Missouri after that for me at number 8. Another team that I think could be great. They could be a top 5 team, a top 3 team, but they haven't played anybody, and they don't play too many people this year. Penn State after that at number 9. Going to go quickly on these, but Josh, I was not super impressed with Penn State really in week 1 or week 2. I know they went on the road, beat West Virginia handily. They did the same thing last year. Drew Aller did the same thing statistically last year against West Virginia at home. Did it on the road this year, and then giving up 27 and having a close game late. against the Fighting Basilacs. That was interesting to me. And then I've got USC at number 10, and this is one I don't feel good about, Josh, and you can maybe touch on it when you get a chance and I shut up talking, but I've got them in top 10 because they have beaten another team that's beaten a team with a roster, but I am not high on LSU, and this second week in a row confirmed it for me. I don't love LSU defensively at all, and now I think they're down another big piece out for the year. So I will say, though, opening weekend, playing a brand, beating a brand means something because right now we don't have much other data to go by, or the data we have is like Notre Dame and Michigan, and it's not great. So by default, putting USC at number 10, I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to let you run with it for a little bit.
Sure, and I think the first thing is obviously I had some stuff wrong last week in retrospect. So as you said, every week we shake it up. Week 1 data doesn't mean a whole lot. Week 2 changes things. Week 3 is going to change things again. I think the important thing, if you do this and you do a ranking early, is you're willing to completely relook at everything you're doing. And I also think one of the biggest challenges when you're doing these is trying to split the hair between who blew somebody out the most in week 1 versus who is the best team, just what you think they are overall. And I don't necessarily mean projecting them against their schedule, because I'm always trying to be schedule agnostic, right? Like I don't want to punish a team because they had a harder schedule or weaker schedule. What I mean by that is you do have to kind of project out who you think a team is going to be, because just because one team beat an FCS 60-0 doesn't necessarily mean that a team that won 30-20 over a real team wouldn't have beaten an FCS 60-0, right? My number 1 is Georgia. I think it's obvious that they have to be the number 1 team in the country. Georgia's week 1 win over Clemson is still one of the most impressive wins. Maybe the exception for the most impressive win might be Texas's win over Michigan, but this sort of falls in the same bucket that I had with the issue of when we did the preview of Notre Dame versus Texas A&M. And that's that I think there are certain quarterbacks right now that are holding teams down. I had doubts over Riley Leonard a little bit in that Notre Dame preview. I had a lot of chirping about that. Turns out I think Texas A&M and Notre Dame both just don't have an offense. And I think Michigan, there was a lot of excuses made after the Fresno State game. I think they don't really have an offense. But I do think they have a great defense. And so the fact that Texas could go in there and put as many points up as they could, as quickly as they could, says a lot about where Texas is. So I have them at number 2, but it still certainly remains to be seen. Number 3 for me is Ohio State. I had them all the way down at number 5, insultingly, in a lot of people's minds. I still thought that was a little funny. We're in week 1. I thought Oregon came out and had just sort of a ho-hum game where they were letting some stuff happen and otherwise looked like a really good team. I thought Ohio State didn't play great in their game against Akron. 17 points in the half. I think it was 17-3 into the third quarter. I know they blew them out, but to me, I really had to see what they look like in week 2. And in week 2, I thought they looked like one of, if not the most dominant teams in the country. I still don't know if Western Michigan's any good. There's a big issue that Western Michigan's week 1 opponent, who I believe was Wisconsin, may themselves not be very good based off how that went last week for them in that game. We'll do a preview of Alabama, Wisconsin. Frankly, just because there's not a ton of good options between people we have a rapport with for our audience and the ranked games this week. Week 3 is kind of a light slate as it turned out. I still think Ohio State's a great team. I saw explosiveness. And the big thing I want to say is they ran more of their offense. And what I really was impressed with was how well they orchestrated a lot of run-pass RPO stuff. They did a lot of stuff with Howard where he would run, do an RPO where he's attacking the edge with a run and pop it out to wide receiver, and they just let the talent take over. I have not seen that from Ohio State in some time. The ease of which they got the ball to their playmakers and let stuff happen. Now, I'll be curious to see if they can do that against better defenses, but I want to give them some major credit because I was obviously way too low on them last week. And really, that wasn't even clickbait. I'm not going to use that excuse. That was just me being an idiot for a week. Number 4 for me is Tennessee. It's the second week they've come out and looked great. They dominated NC State in a game that I thought might be relatively close. Still funny that Tennessee fans were upset when I picked them to cover, but I didn't pick them to cover by enough. Tennessee, to me, I still think defensively, maybe I was underestimating how good they were because they were a top 5 scoring defense in the SEC. Really, most metrics, depending on when to look at it, really top 2 scoring defense, top 2 total defense, all those things is really what I'm referring to. But offensively, they just look really good. The offensive line is excellent. people will point to the passing game. I think the running game is the more impressive part for Tennessee right now, and it's the engine that's making everything turn. Iamaleava is really good at running that offense. I still maintain the one thing I will say from that people were kind of joking about in the preview. Iamaleava, when he makes quick reads, and when I say that I mean limited read play, so RPO plays, wide receiver screens, where he can make point throws, he's deadly. I made a point about layering the ball that people kind of laughed at, but there were some turnovers in that game, and if you go back and look at it, like one of them is he's trying to throw over the middle of the field. I do think he struggles getting proper, people laughed about arcing the ball. He's so used to throwing down on his targets because he's so tall that when he has to navigate throwing over somebody down the middle of the field, it's a little tougher. He needs to see it and throw it. It's very similar, if you want to say this. It's not really a dig. It's the same issue that Trevor Lawrence has due to his height. Cam Newton was a little bit similar. Mariota was a little bit similar. All those tall guys, and I'm comparing him to some really good passers. He's a similar kind of guy. But I say all that to say that in their scheme at Tennessee, this RPO-heavy scheme where they have a lot of, super wide splits where they get the linebackers inside, the DBs are wide, it creates a lot of space. And in that scheme where you run an RPO, he can throw down on the guy. Usually he doesn't have to layer it. So it's not something that's really going to bother him. And I think as long as they can run the ball, they can stay in that scheme. And Tennessee, that's why I have them at number 4. They're a deadly team, I think, with a very, very good defense as long as they can operate that way. And it's only going to be a team that can stop the run, that lets them force Tennessee out of that motor operation, that I think is really going to be able to beat Tennessee. Number 5 for me is Alabama. I think that game was, 42-16 last week. It was not really a 42-16 game. They looked awful. But on the other hand, they looked awful because they were out probably their 2 starting offensive tackles. They put one of them back in the fourth quarter, and they immediately scored 3 touchdowns on 3 drives. So I'm not sure how much I really want to punish them. I'm not sure what all that means other than they had some of the same kinks they had last year with Jalen Milroe. Number 6 for me is Ole Miss. They ain't played nobody, Paul. I think they can play somebody. Number 7 is Missouri. Same deal. I don't really know who they are even in week 2 yet, so I'm just having them almost as a placeholder. Miami is number 8. I'm with you, Daniel. They beat a real team in Florida that I think maybe isn't as bad as they looked, but I think they're also not as good as we thought they might be in week 1, and that I just don't know really what to make of Miami beyond putting them there at 8. 9 for me is Oregon, which is probably controversial. I went back and watched that Boise State-Oregon game, and what I see from Oregon is, the Boise State game, they put up 37 points in that game. They did it earnestly. That is still a very good offense. The offense against Idaho, I will say, in my defense, I think I was right. It was a little bit of a fluke they didn't score more than they did. They kind of kicked them, shot themselves in the foot. Much the same way Alabama did this week. But defensively, they have a real problem stopping the run. And that is an Achilles heel to that team. Now, you say, why are they number 10? Well, name me another team that should be a lot higher that doesn't also have flaws. Maybe you want to say USC. I can buy that. I'm also with Daniel, though, that LSU versus Nicholls State this week. Nicholls State had more yards per attempt than Moss did in their game against LSU. So I think LSU is just a truly bad defense, and I'm really hesitant to bump USC up too much because I think LSU just has some really serious problems. And number 10 for me is also Penn State. I also have not been wowed by them, but I think they're a good team. And we were having this discussion of it really came down to my mind, who would I pick, Oregon, Penn State, or USC to win the game. Right now, I would probably pick Oregon to win 2 out of the 3. Penn State would be the second most likely, and USC the third most likely, but they're all in a clump. And Daniel, that's a long list for me too, but to turn it back to you, do you agree with me that once you hit about 7 or 8 on this list, the difference between number 7 and number 17 or so is small? And all those teams, I feel like right now, I have major questions or I see really significant flaws in that whole group. And it's really hard to judge who to put higher.
I think that right now it's tough. I think by the end of the year, especially with scheduling the way it is, I think you're going to have a few pretenders at the very top, in the top 5, top 10. But I think more than in years past, because of how scheduling, one, we have a pretty good crop of out of conference power games, and 2, schedules are tougher because of super conferences. I think is going to help us separate that number 7 through 17 through 30 group. But I think that the real challenge is going to be, and I'll give you an example, the real challenge is going to be that top 5 or 6 teams. Ole Miss started the season ranked highly because everybody's them and Missouri are this like off-season sexy pick, gained a lot of momentum. Let me tell you the schedule until October 12th. Furman, MTSU, Wake Forest, Georgia Southern, Kentucky, South Carolina. They also have Florida, Mississippi State, Arkansas. They're 3 big games. They're 3 games that they have a prayer of being ranked are LSU, Oklahoma, and Georgia. I guarantee you between LSU and Oklahoma, one of those teams will not finish ranked, possibly both of them. There's a chance that Ole Miss is going to go 11-1, losing their only ranked game, and be like number 3 in the country. And so you juxtapose that with Oklahoma's schedule, Florida's schedule, Alabama's schedule, even Georgia's schedule. Like Georgia might beat Ole Miss by 20 points and be ranked behind them because their schedule is so much tougher. So that's really hard. And again, this is why we've said once you go to this type of scheduling and it's so imbalanced, you have to have the expanded playoffs. But something that's interesting to me, Josh, and I want you to touch on a little bit, is we get accused and the national media gets accused of being SEC homers. But if you look at this list, at least for now, based on what we know, and there's a lot of unknowns, it's like we were talking before, as we were writing out our top 10s, it's hard for me to not put like 8 SEC teams in the top 10. And some of that is because of priors and what we know about rosters. Some of it is you got Michigan, Notre Dame, teams that aren't that great that normally would fill that spot. But how do you, Josh, balance the thought of like it feels like too many in the top 10, but maybe it's not?
Yeah, it's interesting to take your point. I think this is something that we're going to have to keep in mind as the season plays out because the schedules are going to get really unbalanced. Georgia at number 1, they play 4 of the 6 teams ranked behind them. You realize that they play Texas, they play Alabama, they play Ole Miss, they play Tennessee. Of the top 7, it's 4 of the top 7, and they're number 1. So they're playing 4 of the 6 teams ranked behind them. Ole Miss plays Georgia. Right? So, I mean, Ole Miss, you're absolutely right. I mean, Ole Miss could go 11-1, lose to Georgia. Georgia could blow out Ole Miss and go to 10-2 easily with this schedule, losing to Texas and Alabama. And Ole Miss could end up in the SEC championship game over a Georgia team that they're clearly better than them. It is a little crazy, and I think the big thing that's causing that in my mind is Oklahoma and Texas are both top 15 teams. The same thing's happening in the Big Ten. You have USC and Oregon that are both top 15 teams. And so, previously with expansion, the Big Ten's expansion, we griped about this for years, that it's fun to talk, 9 conference ranked game, 9 ranked conference games, 9 conference games, whatever, for rankings purposes, 9 conference games. But when 2 of those games are Maryland and Rutgers, it's like, well, you play 7 traditional Big Tens and you play a bad Big East team, and in Maryland and Rutgers, you're not playing very good teams, right? You're playing teams that probably were easier than your 8th Big Ten team might have been in your old schedule. That ain't happening anymore. So now that you've added Oregon and Oklahoma, some teams are getting harder schedules, but there's also more to spread around, and there's more schedule volatility. We talked about that quite a bit in a lot of our previews. And that means that even within the same conference, things are way more even. So it just gets so hard to judge who is a good team and not a good team. It's so hard to rank. And to your point with the SEC, a lot of people want to joke about the SEC's record or how they've lost in certain games. But we look down this list, right, and the top 15 teams in the country are all undefeated. Now it's just 2-0, but they're undefeated. And there's just a metric ton of SEC teams in that list. What is it? 7 of them, right? Oklahoma. And LSU sitting there at 16. It's half the conference in the top 16. Half the top 16, half the conference. It's an absolute logjam. And I think the problem we're also seeing, Daniel, and maybe I'll end this point, is we're also seeing the reality of expansion taking the best teams out of the pack and out of the Big 12 and sticking them in the Big 10 and the SEC. And this was the other half of our discussion, frankly. I think you could easily have a 10-2 Big 10 or SEC team that really would run the table in the ACC or the Big 12. Georgia could go 10-2 with this schedule. And we've already seen them blow out Clemson, and I think they would blow out Miami. I think they would. Now, they may blow out everybody in the SEC, but I doubt it because of how hard the schedule is. Georgia and Texas are going to have to play. One of them is going to have a loss. And whoever loses that game is probably going to be significantly better than anyone in the Big 12 or the ACC. But they're not going to both be able to get a top 4 slot by rule, and we're going to put a Big 12 or an ACC champ in the top 4. I don't think it's going to take even as long as we thought, Daniel, just because of the landscape of football this year, for people to realize that the concept of conference parity and inclusion is a broken ideal that's just not going to pan out in postseason practice.
The reason you need playoff expansion because of super conference consolidation is the same reason why auto bids for Power 4 conferences is ridiculous. Arkansas should have beaten. They outgained Oklahoma State. It was like 635 to 384, something like that. It was a double overtime loss on the road, and that counts because everybody likes to roll up the SEC is whatever the record is out of conference this year. I know they were doing it after week 1. Look, that Arkansas loss counts as a loss against the SEC. But the SEC sent a team that's probably going to go 2-6 in the conference this year to play the team that is currently the highest ranked Big 12 team that might win the Big 12, went to their house, took them to double overtime, really beat them up and down the field, but had 3 stupid turnovers. And look, Oklahoma State won the game, but the toughest game Oklahoma State might have all year is against a team that's going to go 2-6 in the SEC. To me, that's the difference. It's not just what the records are, it's who you played. And the fact that Arkansas theoretically could win the Big 12 tells you how far apart these teams are, or these conferences are. And I think it's a little tough for me to see, a Georgia is probably 40 points better, 35 points better than Arkansas, and they're not going to get that first round bye because they play in a row 5 teams better than anybody in the Big 12. That's a tough pill for me to swallow when we're talking about winning your conference has to mean something. Yes, it means you get in the playoffs. It doesn't mean that we have to pretend that a team that barely beats Arkansas would do anything close to what Georgia would do with their schedule. Oklahoma State would go 6-6 maybe with Georgia's schedule. And so I don't want us to have to pretend. Win your conference, get in, that's great. But you don't get to play nobody all year, get the luxury of that being why you're in the playoffs, and also get a first-round bye. I think that's ridiculous. Anything else you want to say before we wind this one down?
It's week 2. People were upset enough after week 1 rankings. They'll be upset now. Heck, people will point out the Ohio State-Oregon debate, but if you remember, there were just as many Michigan fans screaming that we didn't have them ranked higher. We're going to learn things next week we didn't know this week. We'll learn things in week 4 we don't know now. I think all that matters is that you keep an open mind. You know that you're going to be wrong about some teams, and when you're wrong, you're willing to say, hey, let's take that, let's reset it. And, let me knock on wood and add the fact, let's not play the game that they have currently done where Florida State was a top 10 team and Georgia Tech beat them, so Georgia Tech became number 23. Georgia Tech was being blown out and finally lost to Syracuse, so they can't be ranked, but Boston College beat Florida State, so now Boston College is number 24. And since Northern Illinois beat Michigan, we put Michigan at 17 and Northern Illinois at 25, which, by the way, is idiotic. If you are doing the rankings based off what's happened to the season, it is idiotic to have Michigan ranked over Northern Illinois. And if you say, well, you can't put Michigan that low, that's fine. Don't rank Michigan until they've earned it. And that's not a bad thing for Michigan. You have the entire season to get back in the rankings with your record. Michigan has no reason to be number 17. I say Michigan, I mean Notre Dame. Notre Dame, crap. All right. You were trying to interrupt me, weren't you?
I was trying to save you. Y'all had to stop recording earlier because he got them swapped, and I think it's because they both have the same offense. Yeah, so I don't think people are going to chirp at us as much this week, if for the only reason being that they're going to do their homework and give us a top 10. So you're going to go through that exercise before you comment about how wrong we are, and you're going to see how hard it is to find 10 teams worthy of a top 10 ranking. But you're going to try. So thanks so much for watching this long. Let us know if you like this segment and if we should keep doing it. Keep an eye out for our Bama and Wisconsin preview later in the week and our SEC tier ranking. If y'all watch that one, then maybe we'll do a Big Ten one too. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.